Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming over to CSIS this evening. My name's Richard Downey. I'm Deputy Director of the Africa Programme here. Wow, nice socks. Been quite off-putting, fluorescent green socks in my line of vision. I might have to move you to the back. But welcome this evening to a book talk that we're having here with Ledio. And last time we hosted Ledio, I tried to pronounce his surname phonetically and embarrassed myself. So Ledio Cakaj, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And he's here to talk about his new book, which has been out only, a month or so now, and he's been busily touring the world trying to flog copies of it and telling people about the story. And I'm going to do his sort of the role of your publicist right now and say that it's a really fantastic read. I have my copy here just to prove that I have been reading it. And there are copies available at the back desk on your way out at the end if you're interested in buying one, and Ledio is committed to signing a copy for anyone who wishes their copy to be signed, and it is $20 cash or $19.95 by card. So that's the sales pitch over with. I should tell you a little bit about the contents of the book before Ledio goes into a bit more detail. But it's about the Lord's Resistance Army, probably one of the most oversimplified and caricatured and perhaps misunderstood armed groups roaming around the African subcontinent. Misunderstood because, despite being around now for 3 decades or more, no one's really got to grips with the problem, although it's reduced so much in size. And like many tough and enduring policy problems, particularly in Africa, it's attracted sort of intermittent attention from all but a few dedicated analysts and experts, and Ledio, fortunately, is one of those experts. So I guess here at CSIS we've been guilty of intermittently focusing on the LRA as well. There was a big spike of interest and somewhat of a circus in 2012 around the Kony 2012 campaign. But Ledio is stuck with the LRA through thick and thin, through sort of peaks of interest and troughs of disinterest. And the book you're seeing today is a product of all that hard work. The LRA obviously are commonly portrayed and depicted as monsters, and certainly they've been guilty of committing monstrous atrocities. But the really unique perspective I think that Ledio offers in this book is to try and put a human face on the people that have been involved in the conflict, and not just those who've been on the receiving end of LRA attacks, but LRA members themselves, many of whom, of course, were initially victims as well. And it's a particularly unique perspective that Ledio shares in his book because he, as well as explaining the narrative of the LRA and a sort of account of how it came into existence and flourished and still endures to this day, he tells the story of one of the LRA fighters themselves, a bodyguard who had personal access to Joseph Kony, who you call George in the book. And it's just a fascinating account and puts a human face on a conflict that, while it sort of defies belief to us that someone would willingly join a group such as this, and that's what George did. He wasn't one of those who was abducted. He willingly joined. The way you explain his story and the narrative that sort of runs through the book shows that he made decisions that, while we might think are irrational, actually seemed rational and made sense to him and the people around him. So I'll leave you to talk about the book itself. But yeah, we also might reflect tonight in some of the Q&A when we later on some of the current events as well. Obviously, your books come out at a timely moment with the trial just beginning last week in The Hague of Dominic Ongwen, charged with crimes against humanity and war crimes by the ICC. He's a character that features in your book, and maybe you'd be able to talk a little bit about that trial and your thoughts on that. And of course, with the new administration taking office here, it will be interesting to hear your thoughts on how the new administration should view this problem, which, while it has lessened to a large extent, is still there and endures to this day. So I'll hand over to you, Ledio. I actually haven't done a very good job, and actually a job at all, of explaining who you are to those who don't know you. I think many people in the room do know you, but Ledio is a researcher and writer. Is focused on armed groups, demobilization and reintegration of former combatants, both adults and children. Has worked for 2 decades or more in Central Africa, on the Central Africa region and the Balkans as well, and in particular is focused on the Lord's Resistance Army, initially during a master's degree at Princeton University, later working at the World Bank, the Enough Project, Small Arms Survey, and other groups as well. And Ledio has a very interesting personal history and story, which he sort of alludes to in the book, and I don't know if that helps you identify with some of the, not all of them of course, but some of the traumas and events that George encounters in his story. So with that, I'll hand over to you, Ledio. Thanks for coming, and we look forward to hearing you talk a little bit about the book, and then we'll open for discussion.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, CSIS, for having me. I'll first start by giving a quick summary of what's going on with the LRA right now, as well as the international response. It's going to be 30 years since the LRA was first founded next year. So a problem that has been going on for a long time and continues to be an issue for a lot of civilians. There are, although the LRA has been significantly weakened, Joseph Kony is still at large. We believe that he's based somewhere in between South Sudan and Sudan, near the CAR border, with 100, 120 fighters or so, separated in 5 or 6 groups, based in DRC, some parts of DRC, obviously, South Sudan, or mostly actually between South Sudan and North Sudan, in an area called Kafia Kingi, as well as in Central African Republic. They have also another 50 or so women and children, that the children were born in captivity. There are, I think, between 200 or 300 Ugandan fighters, Ugandan soldiers rather from the Ugandan army, and another 120 U.S. Special Forces that are there to support the Ugandan offensive against the LRA. Although, as of late, in the last couple of years or so, the mission has stalled a little bit, partly because of the LRA is operating in very difficult environments, and partly because the willingness of the Ugandan army has, I think, lessened in the last couple of years. There was some speculation that the Ugandan mission was going to withdraw by October of this year, and then by the end of this year. But now it appears it might continue until, I believe, maybe spring of next year, which puts into question the role of the U.S. Strategy, and most importantly, the U.S. Army, which is a significant component of the strategy to defeat the LRA as part of a bill that President Obama signed in 2009. It's been useful to have had the American Special Forces be out there in the field, partly I think because they've been very good at trying to encourage defections of fighters, trying to encourage defections of LRA members who, most of them were abducted themselves, I think probably were victims rather than sort of perpetrators. But as I said, they still continue to be an issue, and it's unclear whether by next year, the 30th anniversary of the LRA, Kony will still be at large. I hope that the U.S. mission will continue, even with the new administration. I think they were renewed for another few months. So hopefully that might be, for some, I keep thinking of this 30 number as being somewhat superstitious. Maybe next year it will be done, and maybe not, but that we'll hope for the best. And I want to go back to this idea of the perpetrator and victim, which is, of course, the issue of Dominic Ongwen. Is the former LRA member, commanded some groups, and he was abducted as a child, and he's now in front of the International Criminal Court in The Hague, the first former child soldier to be at the court, and obviously someone who is accused of some of the same crimes that were perpetrated against him in the first place. It's a very interesting and case and raises many questions, I think. One of them is whether we can continue to hold child soldiers responsible after, for crimes they commit after they turn a certain age. In the sort of DDR field, we tend to, at least what I've seen personally, we tend to look at former child soldiers as sort of being a continuum and, somewhat maybe not entirely responsible for all their actions, particularly if they were committed against their will or forced somewhat or under duress of some form. It will be interesting to see whether that will be the case with Mr. Ongwen, and whether that particular part of his life, that of being abducted and at a young age and forced to commit atrocities, will be taken into consideration during the case, or other in mitigation, which is after a verdict has been reached. I'm happy to talk more about Ongwen later. I know it's an interesting topic, and it's one that I think has raised many questions, and I hope that at least that the trial gives a chance to Mr. Ongwen himself to tell his story, as well as other people, including obviously the victims, to tell the story of the history of the conflict and how it came about. And this brings me to the idea of context, the historical background. How did we get here? How does the LRA exist? A lot of people learn about the LRA and Kony from Kony 2012, which was somewhat without context, I think, to put it mildly. And part of the reason why I wanted to write the book was because I felt that this conflict needed to be explained. How did this story happen? How did we get to a point where we have a man bent on abducting children and forcing them to commit unspeakable acts for his own benefit or survival? And also partly because I had a lot of information. Over the years, I've interviewed, I think, over close to 500 or so former LRA members, men, women, some of them young children as well, and many other NGO representatives, Army, Ugandan Army, obviously US Army. So it was a lot of information that I felt that I sort of wanted to put somewhere, and the book is a product of that. It is primarily a modern history of the LRA, particularly of the last 10 years. That is when, from 2006, when the LRA was based in northeastern Congo in Garamba Park, and they started peace talks, Juba peace talks, with support of the then South Sudanese government, or part of South Sudanese government before South Sudan became independent. And until 2015 or so about 10 years. But it's also, as Richard mentioned, the history of one particular member who actually joined the LRA during the Juba talks, during the peace talks, who I thought had an interesting story. He was a very interesting character, very smart, had a keen eye for detail, but also was in many ways the antithesis to the stereotypical child or young fighter that, particularly in African context, that we, I guess, have expected to read about or learn. The sort of the young African male bent on violence, on drugs and so on. And George, the character, was none of those. He was a young man at 18 or so when he joined the LRA, very smart, was about to graduate high school, but because of some difficult circumstances, he was expelled about 2 terms before graduating, and then was faced with fairly difficult choices, nearly impossible, and in the end because of his family connections and the way that he thought about his future, he decided to join during the Juba talks. And many people don't know this, but he was one of many. Not a huge number, but 20 or 30 or more people joined during the Juba talks, as opposed to being abducted and forced to stay in the LRA, which is usually their modus operandi. And also, so George, because of his keen intellect and his education, which was unrivaled in the LRA, he was also taken under Kony's wing and was supposed to be one of his secretary, but eventually ended up being a bodyguard. And in the LRA sort of world, a bodyguard is more of a aide de camp, more of a assistant, someone that has a full loyalty and trust of the boss, and therefore is trusted with many important jobs, including intimate access. And I think that's something to Kony, obviously. And that's something that I thought was interesting, and that's something that came out very strongly after the whole Kony 2012, this idea that this man was, I think he was called evil and Satan, like a Satan, and by some actually high-level members of U.S. Foreign policy circles, European, and so on. So this idea that he was like a demonized, like someone that we could not relate to it at all, which was somewhat in a contrast with the sort of the view that I got from talking to former fighters and former members. Not to say that he hasn't committed all these terrible things, but obviously, but to say that he obviously is human in many ways, it's sort of this surreal descriptions of him playing with his children, or sort of tender moments, and that I think in many ways might shed some light on some of the decision making, not only of people like Joseph Kony, but also other sort of rebel leaders. We can talk maybe later a little bit maybe about the parallels between the LRA and their leaders and Boko Haram and Shabab and so on. But I thought that was very interesting to hear George talk about Kony's obsession with the spirits, but also this idea that he felt. I have a chapter in there, it's called Prisoner of the Spirits, and that's based on this idea that Kony kept referring to himself as being chosen, as being forced to do this for this particular aim, and whether or not that's true and that's how it was felt, I think was an important sort of moment to describe about how people, particularly of sort of Kony's nature, tend to see themselves and tend to see their role in the world. And while I'm very much familiar with sort of the atrocities that the LRA has committed, and I want to make very, very clear, and I think I have to a certain extent said that in the book as well, that I am in no way trying to sort of simplify or minimize their violence. I've been to places, hours after LRA attacks have happened in DRC, in CAR, and parts of South Sudan. I've seen the atrocities firsthand, and there have been some terrible things. But rather than just sort of humanize the group, I sort of wanted to explain some of the sort of like more like human or more humane concepts, or that drives this group. Partly because I feel in many ways when we tend to demonize groups like the LRA or Al-Shabaab and so on, then at a policy level, the solutions or the policy proposed tend to sort of focus only on the kind of more belligerent aspect, because obviously if someone is portrayed as irrational, then all rational approaches that perhaps doesn't always include the weapons or guns are usually overlooked. So again, and I don't talk too much about this in the book, but I sort of wanted to tease out this idea that there are other groups at this stage that operate like the LRA, particularly in Africa, that might not be the same at all, obviously, but there are some similarities. And I think, and I hope that it gives some, idea to what policymakers, and this is not a policy book at all, but it's also the idea. But I want to talk about how policy can sometimes be influenced by the way that we or other people frame certain groups and certain issues, and maybe something as a bit of a pitfall, I think, there as well. And I guess lastly, I just wanted to, while I wrote the book and wanted, now that it came out, also wanted to continue to bring attention to the issue of communities, particularly in northern Uganda, where the international aid groups have already moved on. Obviously, there has been no LRA war there since at least 2006. But the need for assistance, obviously, in places like CAR and DRC and South Sudan is huge. It's even more so in northern Uganda, where you have entire communities that have been traumatized, have been affected by the violence, that have been somewhat neglected. And I hope that people who read the book or know about it can continue to find ways or to support as much as possible, either through personal donations or through maybe policy, USAID level. I was shocked to hear the other day that the U.S. Special Forces, like the military aspect of the anti-LRA war, has been close to about $1 billion. And I think the humanitarian aspect, I think it's been more like 10 or 20 million. So I think that's, I hope that will change that lack of balance right there.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Ledio. I want to give everyone a chance to ask some questions about both the book itself and broader questions about the LRA and where it's going. But I was reading earlier, and I was drawn to something you said in the end of your introduction, the final sentence, I think, of your introduction, which was, as you tell the story, you point out that but for a geographical accident of birth, George could have easily been me or you. Now, I was wondering, has there been any? Why did you say that? And have you sort of encountered any pushback to that argument? Or have people criticised you, as you maybe you sort of said at the beginning, for trying to humanise the members of this group? And how did George end up in this predicament? Without, I know a lot of people haven't read the book and don't give all the details away. But how did this guy with good school grades, as you said, a smart person, end up joining a group at the very time when talks were starting that would have didn't turn out that way, that could have ended the conflict and demobilized the soldiers?
It comes up all the time. I've been asked that question. No one has really criticized me for this, but it's something that people ask about. And it's mostly come up because of my own personal story, and people who know that have asked me whether that's it. And I'm an American now, but I'm an Albanian citizen. I was born in Albania, rather, and left Albania when I was 16 to work in Greece as an illegal immigrant, and eventually made it to England, where eventually I sort of got my papers and went to school there, and eventually grad school here. So. Not that these are at all similar, but there are some parallels there that I think I sometimes draw between George's story and my story, and that's about the idea of choice and what choices you have, or what you perceive as possible choices, particularly with a sort of target in mind, to obviously have a better future, have a bright future. And in the case of George, unlike me, all the countries near northern Uganda couldn't offer him the same sort of potential glimmer of hope that I had, going to Greece, which was a nicer place at the time. I mean, it's 20 years ago. But George instead had, the choices were, he couldn't go back to school anymore, even though he really wished he wanted to, or he could join the ranks of the unemployed in northern Uganda, or maybe go become a farmer. And farmer, obviously, it's more of sort of a work in small villages just to survive. It's something that he had never done. He had gone to school for all of his life, and he had really high hopes for himself. And I think rightly so. He was very smart, and he is very smart and well-read. And the other choice at the time that didn't seem so bleak was joining the LRA. And the reason why I say it wasn't so bleak was because at the time that he was thinking about joining, although he never really wanted to, had some family push, there was a general sort of belief in northern Uganda that the peace talks were going to succeed. That is, that the Ugandan government and Joseph Kony would reach agreements to come out peacefully, and that that the former LRA members, particularly the men, obviously would be reintegrated in the Ugandan army. So this idea of a demobilization package, like that would come out at least with something, some food, obviously some money, but more so because based on other agreements that President Museveni had made with other former rebel leaders, that was this belief and hope that the fighters would be taken into the Ugandan army as soldiers with a salary and so on. Again, not maybe a huge sort of life dream right there, but for George, I think it was something that he thought would be risky, but with a maybe belief that he would come out without having to fight, and he would be seen more of a intellectual type, and come out and maybe get a job. I mean, this is, I think, the sad part of it all, that in the end, it's all about that the decision was made for any sort of beneficial, like material gain, and to get a job. So that's I think, I don't know if that answered your question, but that was, in essence, why that happened.
Well, look, let's hear from you, and feel free to answer ask some questions. Let's start with the lady there who put your hand up first. There's a microphone coming round, and please identify yourself and ask away.
Well, I hear you on he didn't have a lot of choices and he had some reasons for choosing this, but when it wasn't turning out that way, why did he stay? What was it that led him to be willing to commit these atrocities when he didn't have the excuse of having been forced into it?
Should I answer or should I get back?
Yeah, let's take a couple of questions, and then and the lady at the back row in the corner there. And sorry, could you identify yourself as well?
Oh. Hi, my name's Kiana. And I actually worked in Uganda for a few years and visited the Gulu area really often. And when you were speaking, you spoke about how there's, $1 billion for the military portion of the United States package, but the humanitarian portion only has $20 to $30 million. Based on a lot of the things that I saw in northern Uganda, though, $20 to $30 million is not a lot of money. One of the concerns that a lot of the community members had is they were wondering even where that money was going, in terms of it wasn't making it to the people who were most impacted by the war. So my question for you is, if we are calling to increase that amount of money, how can we better ensure that it goes toward the purpose that the people on the ground would like it to go to, and also make sure we're going as far as possible with the money that is being given?
Okay, thank you. And Jennifer, you had a question as well.
Thanks. Thank you, Ledio. I wondered about the mobilizing ideology of Joseph Kony. I mean, is it just about getting jobs and stature, or is there a religious overtone still to what he talks about, is one question. The other is about the Ugandan forces. Are they given permission to work in DRC and Sudan? And what about the armies of the militaries of those countries, since the LRA is no longer in Uganda?
Okay, thanks. Should we start with those,
Sure.
and we'll come back for some more?
So why did he stay? It's a good question, and it's something that might apply easily to Dominic Ongwen, even though obviously different circumstances. I think in George's case, he stayed because he had no choice in the end. It became impossible to leave from northern DRC to make it back to northern Uganda. He went there on UN helicopter and a plane. So from home all the way, it's really far. So to be able to return voluntarily would have been suicide. He wouldn't be able to make it out alive, even if everything else was fine. But he he tried many times to escape, and I talk about it in the book, or at least he wanted to escape but couldn't. He would have been caught and hurt, if not killed outright, by other LRA members. But the sheer distance in this book, in this particular instance, but also then when they moved to Central African Republic, are pretty much really difficult to traverse. And that's what I allude to in the title as well. The walking, it's something that comes up all the time with everyone you talk to, and it's like one of sort of the biggest enemies that they have, particularly now that they are in parts of CAR that are almost 1,000 miles away from home, in difficult terrains that they have to walk every day. So I think he very much wanted to come out, and he very quickly realized that he made a terrible mistake, but he was stuck for a long time. The atrocities, I don't have a lot of evidence that he committed a lot of atrocities. He definitely was involved in some of them. Although, of course, when it comes to who committed what, sort of the passive voice comes out, and it's kind of hard to understand exactly who did what. But one thing that is very, very clear, not only with George but everyone else, and also I think probably with Ongwen as well, is that this was many, many ways a fight for survival. I mean, there was no two ways about it. Maybe not in the early days, but particularly recently, I described some attacks that take place, which I actually saw from both sides. I was at the place where they were attacked by the LRA, and then later spoke to people who had been part of that attack. And it was, and in many ways, it was literally people were being killed to take their food. And it's a terrible thing to have in this day and age, but that's the way it was. And that was for George too, I think. The money, yeah, so let me clarify, the 20 million I was talking about, I actually didn't even refer to Northern Uganda. That was mostly, that was being spent on the CAR, I think, and I think parts of DRC. I'm not quite sure about the numbers, but USAID, I think, has been spending some money on UNICEF and giving them to CRS, Catholic Relief Service, I think, has done some work. Northern Uganda, I think, has changed. There are now a lot more local organizations that work, particularly some of them funded by former LRA members, women that were abducted, or also men that were involved. I hate saying this, but I think Invisible Children is doing a good job now. I mean, they've changed the leadership, and obviously I don't hate saying this. I actually think that they are the only ones who actually stuck it up. And they are doing some good work across the borders. That is, a little bit in Northern Uganda and a lot in CAR and DRC. So there are mechanisms now to be able to help people, for sure. And the best way to do it, I personally, when I give money, particularly now for Christmas or whatever, I've been giving to local communities. People like the sisters, the Kony sisters, for instance, have done some really interesting work. Important work, rather, in Congo and South Sudan, and they're based in Northern Uganda. And as I said, there are lots of local organizations now, particularly in Northern Uganda, that are doing, I think, a great job, and no huge overhead costs, and they're operating on a very sort of small budget. One challenge I've had is to figure out a way to have money go directly to them, maybe through GoFundMe or a place like that. And I'm hoping to put together something that links people directly to giving money from here to there, rather than with middlemen and overhead. The ideology is, it's interesting because, when you read these, 300 or 400 word articles that usually come on the LRA, there is a paragraph in the end saying something about Kony being messianic and 10 Commandments and all that. And I've never found that when talking when I talk to people who were part of the LRA. They never talk about, the importance of the Old Testament and the God this, and that's, I think, partly because the LRA is, or at least the ideology, has been very sort of pragmatic on Kony's part. I have a conversation there that in the book about Kony giving this sort of like anti-colonialist view of religion, and he talks about sort of the white priest and almost like Marxist in its sort of description. And how they use the African religion, and how they sort of pit people against one another so they can take their lands. So, which is very interesting because, of course, everyone knows the LRA, or people who know the LRA know about it as being a Christian fundamentalist group, and that it is not. I think, at least the way that I've found. You can see the sort of the pragmatism, the adaptability over the years. When Sudanese armed forces were supporting the LRA in the mid-90s, the late 90s. Kony gave orders to pray on the Juma on Friday, to not sit together with women, to not eat pork, and you get these LRA former fighters, nicknames that are sort of very Arabic. or Arabic sounding. So, and then of course there is a lot of an element of the Acholi religious or cultural beliefs, sort of the spirits, which are very important because people who are abducted understand, they know that idea. I mean, they grew up with the idea of spirits and something that I think we'll probably see in the Ongwen case as well, that those things were very important, and Kony used them because as a sort of adhesive to get people together, as a bonding mechanism, because that's what he knew, and that's what people that he abducted would understand, and they responded to that. I mean, people are still terrified that the spirits will get them and all the things like that, and so it worked. I don't know if I forgot anything else, but the UPDF and the UPDF does, as far as if I know, and this was the case some time ago, and I think still is the case, the UPDF is not allowed to operate in Congolese territory. There are Congolese forces, the FARDC, who go out sometimes and patrol, and I think they've received some help from the U.S. Army. I'm not sure to what extent. At some point, they just got some boots, I think, and uniforms and some training, but not the same way that the Ugandans receive or have received, which involves a lot of logistics, intelligence gathering, and other sort of types of support. Sudan, I know you said Sudan. So that's the issue here that comes up all the time. Why can we get Kony? Obviously, he operates in an area that's really large. I think it's the size of Puerto Rico. But it is under the control of Sudanese armed forces, or some form of control. It's unclear that it is possible to control the area. You know, it's home to sort of some form of rebel forces, drug dealers, and sort of nomadic cattle herders, and it's very difficult to obviously control the whole area, even though Kony has been based there or in and out of that area for I think 4 or 5 years now. So the question is, do the Sudanese armed forces have anything to do with Kony in the sense that are they supporting him the way that they used to? I think the answer to that is no. It used to be that they had liaison officers that were so close together and cooperating. The LRA received weapons, received military support back in the day, from the mid-90s to the late 90s. It all changed after 2001, after September 11th particularly. There seems to be some sort of support for Kony that comes from some military forces, Sudanese armed forces, but I think it's more of a local level rather than organized from sort of like the higher echelons. And I doubt it very much that President Bashir would even care anymore about Kony, let alone making sure that he supports him, I think. But I don't have any evidence, so it's more of a guess.
Let's take some more questions then. Leslie. So the microphone is coming.
Hi, Leslie Warner, House Foreign Affairs Committee. I have 2 questions. The first one is, if my memory serves, there was a spike in LRA attacks earlier this year. So how would you have us interpret that? And a related question is related to an article you wrote about a year ago talking about fissures within the LRA. Have those fissures continued? And again, how would you have us interpret that? And the second question is, there have been proposals, given the relative success of the messaging campaign encouraging defections from the LRA, there's been some momentum towards trying to replicate that with other rebel groups across the continent. Although there's the counter-argument that the counter-LRA, counter-messaging effort was really unique and was really reliant on local NGOs, and also, as you wrote in Monkey Cage blog, showing that, former fighters have a life after they have defected from the LRA. So would you agree that it is a unique context, or are there elements of that sort of defection messaging that could be replicated to other areas?
Okay, thank you. At the back there, lady there.
Thank you. My name's Tara, and actually my question dovetails well with her second one. For the defection messaging, my understanding is it's been most effective when used in conjunction with more offensive military actions to create enough confusion and opportunities for the fighters to leave without facing the the possible death if they get caught. So with the Ugandans becoming less eager to go out and actually be offensive in trying to take on the LRA, do you see the same role for defection messaging for the come home messages, or how can we adjust them to make them as effective as they used to be?
And thank you. And we'll take one more question at the front here, Zach.
Thanks. Thanks, Ledio. Zach Verdon from the Wilson Center. I thought I'd spice it up a little. You both have mentioned or alluded to some of this, but your thoughts on the impact of popular Western advocacy around the LRA and its shaping of Western policy, and do you think there are lessons to be learned, surely, but ways to have a discussion about that? Because I think it's very much a similar flavor of what happened in Sudan, which many of us think was mostly counterproductive, and I worry that maybe we're moving on from both of these cases and this will happen again. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, let's take those questions and then see if you have any time for any more.
Okay. Wow. Great questions,
Yeah.
and lots to talk about. Yeah, so thank you, Lizzie. I think that the point is important that I forgot to mention, which is, of course, that there was a spike in attacks. There were about, I think, 300 people abducted in the first 6 months of 2016 alone, which is sort of terrifying. I mean, we're talking about a group that is supposed to be done, and yet they're abducting people. What does it mean? It means that the LRA is definitely a multiplying factor. They have this capacity to terrify people, obviously, and abduct people, and they know how to do it, and they're very efficient at doing it. The fear is that so far Kony hasn't really, or seems to have not promoted from non-Ugandan people, so Central African Republic or from South Sudan. If that happens, I think the LRA could definitely become quite a force to be reckoned with again, if Kony is able to put non-Ugandans in positions of control and then continue the same sort of strategy that he's done over the last 30 years. I think they can certainly become an even more terrifying force than they are now. But that hasn't happened so far, and obviously the Ugandan numbers have been depleted because he hasn't been able to abduct from Uganda for 10 years. And obviously it's an indication that you can't ignore them. They will find ways, or Kony will find a way to continue to cause problems. The split, the internal dissent, those have continued. Obviously, Dominic Ongwen was part of that internal dissent has been going on for a while. And when he was almost killed on Kony's order, he managed to escape. He had made plans to do so with one of his sort of colleagues, who is now operating his own group, 20 or 30 fighters. And that, in many ways, is good, but it's also in the sense that this, he left the LRA. He doesn't want to. This other member, we call him Doctor for some reason. It's a nickname, I think. But he's operating by himself. He's not coming out. And he's continuing to sort of operate under the same LRA guidelines, but not taking any orders from Kony. So what that might show is two things. Is that, well, first of all, the LRA also seem to have inspired copycats, right? Some attacks in Congo that we cannot ascertain they're LRA. There are other groups that pretend to be the LRA. And this particular group that I was talking about, the group that has gone rogue, doesn't come out, and I think the reason is because they're afraid. They're afraid of of either being killed by the civilians who they come across, and want to desert, or the Ugandan army. I mean, a lot of these people grew up in the LRA for many years with that, being told that they're going to come out, they're going to get killed by the Ugandan army, they're going to get castrated, they're going to get thrown in prison, they're going to get poisoned, as a way of sort of maintaining, having them stay in the movement. But which is why I think the DDR aspect is crucial. But the DDR aspect has to be crucial not only in the messaging, but also in ensuring somehow that these people are taken care of. And the problem that we have is that obviously Dominic Ongwen's case didn't help. But that wasn't as big of a problem, I think, from what I've spoken to people, as the Kwoyelo case. This other former LRA who is now facing charges in Uganda, has been so for 7 years now, and it seemed to be going nowhere, where it seemed that he was actually eligible for amnesty like everyone else. And that has confused a lot of people in the LRA. They say, why? I mean, we knew that Ongwen was part of the ICC, he was indicted. But this other fighter, Kwoyelo, who was not a top commander, it was not. And why is he going in court? So I think that's, so the problem with DDR messaging is that the messengers cannot guarantee their message. So I would very much, want to figure out a way to say to have the American Special Forces figure out, make sure that what they say remains true. In the message they say, come home, you're going to be okay, nothing's going to happen to you. And I think they've also been smart enough to put maps and, not only come out, but this is how you do it. I think it's also very important. But then they cannot guarantee what happens to these people when they come out, when they're out there in northern Uganda. And I think that's a terrifying prospect for a lot of people who grew up in the area with this paranoia and this fear of dying. And everyone I've interviewed has said that everyone wants to come out, but they're really scared. And that's where I think DDR can work in trying to take some of that fear away. And I think the more we continue, I think more people will come. Although it's now a slow process because we are really now like down to the bare, 90 or so, Ugandans, 80 Ugandans or so. How can DDR work without military pressure? That's a good point. And that's something that I've argued before, that you don't necessarily need to have military action as such. You need to have, to a certain extent, the perception of military action. One of the times I think the Ugandans were not doing much, one of the American Special Forces commanders had this bright idea of using helicopter noises. They would just go in helicopters and play loud music, or I don't know, loudspeakers. It gave the perception that things were happening. If you are in the sort of the jungle or the forest or sort of under a thick canopy and you hear all this noise around you in helicopters, that will keep you on your toes. That creates the perception of fighting. And as you can read from the book, these guys very rarely came across the Ugandan army. As you would imagine that there's like constant fighting. There wasn't, because of the vastness of the territory they operate. So most of the people in the area die of hunger, they die of thirst, they die of diseases, or being shot at by the Arab boys or the local communities, or things like HIV and things like that. So I think that even if the Ugandans leave, I think the American Special Forces can still do a good job, I think, or relatively so, by combining their assets, either using helicopters or maybe using some of the FACA, the local Central African Republic forces, or DRC forces, FARDC. So there is, I think, a lot to be done. And I think in many ways that's something that, you're not really trying to kill people. I think in many ways, I think particularly the same people that were abducted themselves and who carry with them children and unarmed women. So I think I feel happier, more confident about suggesting to do something like that rather than go out there and sort of mow people down, which has happened, or bombing them. So that was that. And then the other thing, the advocacy impact. Well, obviously, the Kony 2012 was in many ways a brilliant campaign. It was a PR campaign, I think. It knew what it wanted to do, and I think it achieved that, in the sense that they wanted to galvanize support, they wanted to make Kony famous. Obviously, there were problems with that because, I've been working on the issue for a long time. But, my father in Albania calls me after the video. I've been working on the LRA for 5 years, and he's like, hey, have you heard of this Kony guy? And I was just like, well, I've done nothing else. And I hear that everywhere I go now. It's like, and it's usually young people who come to me, maybe not so young anymore, but they ask about it. And, it's annoying that they're now cynical. It's like, oh, so that Kony thing was all a money thing, was just a scam. And, I think there's sort of lessons there to be learned that, that I think this was maybe a genuine attempt to raise attention. It wasn't, it was done for a particular purpose. I had problems with the video, obviously, but it did achieve a lot of support. It also, I think, happened to be a bit of a death knell for the invisible children, because they maximize their donor support, their donor base, and sort of then that's it. People are going to give them money every year, small amounts, gave it all at once, and I think that their funding suffered enormously as a result. But I think there are definitely lessons to be learned there for advocacy movements, how it all worked out, how they got so much support. One thing I want to clarify is that this is a common misperception that, and it's obviously an error, that Kony 2012 brought about the U.S. soldiers or the U.S. strategy, which wasn't the case at all. That obviously predated Kony, so 2012, the video. So advocacy groups were doing work before the video and were somewhat successful, but they did that by sleeping outside, congressmen and senators' offices and, pushing them to sign this bill. So like through more traditional advocacy mechanisms, and those, should still continue, I think, from a lessons learned point of view. And the video itself has some lessons learned, I think some of them mentioned, but also some pitfalls, So, craft your message, a little bit more balanced. But again, I think the video had they had something in mind, and whether or not you agree with that, they certainly were successful in achieving that, I think.
Well, thank you. I hope this short conversation has enticed you to go out and read a little bit more and about this fascinating story. I guess you've hit on it at various points, but just in closing, are we ever going to see the back of the LRA, Ledio?
I mean, I keep saying
on,
30 years.
tell us.
30 years. Next year, I mean, I don't know why I felt like there will be a pivotal moment. It is certainly going to be a pivotal year for this country, but maybe. People also said there is a symbiotic relationship between President Museveni and Kony, and maybe if one goes, the other goes. I don't know, but I'm hoping that next year, it's going to be it.
Okay.
Yes, don't quote me though, but
30 is a nice round number.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.